Marginal ridges. In both maxillary and mandibular arches, marginal ridges of adjacent posterior teeth shall be at the same level, or within 0.5 millimeters of the same level. In scoring, do not include the canine premolar contact, and do not include the distal of lower first premolars. If adjacent marginal ridges deviate from 0.5 to 1 millimeter, then 1 point is scored for that interproximal contact. If the marginal ridge discrepancy is greater than 1 millimeter, then 2 points shall be scored for that interproximal contact. No more than 2 points will be scored for any contact point. The marginal ridge will be considered as the most occlusal point that is within 1 millimeter of the contact at the occlusal surface of adjacent teeth.
Now we pick up the maxillary cast again. Hold the gauge perpendicular to the occlusal plane. This occlusal plane. Hold it perpendicular. Run the 1 millimeter stepped in along the posterior teeth marginal ridges, moving in the mesial to distal direction, then reversing and moving distal to mesial. As I measure this cast, I detect a catch on the mesial of the first molar and also on the distal. Therefore, I will score the second to first molar contact 1 millimeter. 1 point. And so, because of this, it is less than a millimeter, but more than a half millimeter. This particular measurement is not for a singular tooth, but for the contact itself, or the interproximal contact. Likewise, the first molar to second molar is 1 point. So that will be 2. I'm going to score these on this 1, 1 on that right side. My rule of thumb for measuring marginal ridges is if there is a catch, but the 1 millimeter step clears the adjacent marginal ridge, it is less than a millimeter. If the ridge is above the 1 millimeter step, of course, it is 2. Now I do the same thing to the 2 mesial-distal sweeps. And there is a definitive catch on the first molar that is less than 1 millimeter, so it scores them at 1. Okay? So, I will score that 1 over here, so that makes, and I usually will mark, if you see, I will mark within the diagram on the form, I will mark the score for each of the arches. It just helps me remember. Now if we move to the mandibular cast, I sweep over the marginal ridges on the left, mesial distal, distal, distal to mesial, and I detect nothing. Move to the right side, mesial distal, looks like a bump there. So a distinct bump with the marginal ridge of the second molar that is less than a millimeter, so 1 point. Nothing measured in the other direction though. Remember on the CR Eval reference sheet, there is a reminder that the board does not include the canine premolar contact and does not include the distal of the lower first premolar. That has to do with the anatomy of the first premolar. For the total of these 2 cases, and I'll write down 1 over on this one, that is now, for marginal ridges, I have 3 plus 1 is 4 for the total score. So that was a little easier than the alignment, I believe. The buccolingual inclination parameter is the next.
Buccolingual inclination. The buccolingual inclination of the maxillary and mandibular posterior teeth shall be assessed by using a flat surface that is extended between the occlusal surfaces of the right and left posterior teeth. When positioned in this manner, the straight edge should contact the buccal cusps of contralateral mandibular molars and premolars. The lingual cusps should be within 1 millimeter of the surface of the straight edge. In the maxillary arch, the straight edge should contact the lingual cusps of the maxillary molars and premolars, and then the buccal cusps should be within 1 millimeter of the surface of the straight edge. Do not score the mandibular first premolars, nor the distal cusps of the second molars. If the mandibular lingual cusps or maxillary buccal cusps are more than 1 millimeter, but less than 2 millimeters from the straight edge surface, 1 point shall be scored for that tooth. If the discrepancy is greater than 2 millimeters, then 2 points are scored for that tooth. No more than 2 points shall be scored for any tooth.
To measure the buccolingual inclination on the maxillary cast, view the cast from the posterior, looking down the occlusal plane. One aid is to quickly visualize the teeth that may be tipped using the flat surface of the measurement gauge, as so. Place it across the occlusal surfaces. In this case, it's obvious that there's some problems present. Now, to actually measure the inclination, place the gauge on its bottom edge with the 1 millimeter steps facing inward. And this is the edge that will be used for the maxillary cast. I will actually support the side of the gauge with my index finger, and that will help hold them over the palatal or lingual cusps. You move the gauge from side to side, and this will allow the 1 millimeter steps to be positioned over the facial cusp tips and held steady. Remember that the second molar cusps are not measured in either the maxillary or the mandibular arch. You just measure the mesial cusp in each one of those circumstances. Now let's look at this particular case. The right side mesial buccal cusp tip of the second molar is between 1 to 2 millimeter steps and would receive a score of 1 point. Then we move to the left. The left side, second molar, the mesial buccal cusp tip, again is between the first and second molar step, and it also would receive 1 millimeter. Now I'll move to the maxillary first molars. Both buccal cusp tips may be scored. The mesial palatal cusp tips are used as the reference plane. So in this case, the facial, get this position right, the facial cusp tips are used as the reference plane, and so if we can hold it steady enough, we can see that the right side first molars are over the 2 millimeter. So for that particular molar tooth that's fairly buccally inclined will be 2. And that's the maximum for any given tooth, even though both those cusp tips are over 2 millimeter. Go to the left side, and we see it's between 1 and 2, so that left first molar will be scored 1. Now move to the premolars, and the second premolars move back and forth are all less than 1 millimeter. Let's go to the first ones, and that likewise. So I hope you notice that I continue to move forward using my index finger to help support the gauge as you move it back and forth. So I'm going to record the these maxillary scores, 2 on the upper right, 1 on the upper right second, 1 and 1 for both the molars on that side. So that's a total of 5 for that particular maxillary model. Now let's move to the mandibular arch. Again, we can look from the posterior using the flat side of the gauge back and forth. Again, we can see there are some difficulties there. Looks like problems also. We flip the gauge over to the top of the gauge. I'll place my index finger for support, and I'll slide the gauge back and forth, place it over the mesiobuccal cusp tips of the second molars, and if we look at the left mesiolingual cusp tip, it's over 2 millimeters over the 2 millimeter step and would score 2 points. We move to the right side, and it's between, looks like it's between 1 and 2, so it would be 1 point. So 2 and 1 for the lower second molars. Moving forward, we would place the cusp tips or the gauge over the mesial buccal cusp tip, and looks like the left side is greater than 1 millimeter for both of those cusps, so 1 point. Yet the right side cusp tip also is 1 point here. So both of those first molars will receive 1 point scores. Now we move to the first of all, the first premolars in the lower arch, based on the rules, are not not scored because they commonly have a diminutive cusp tip. Usually the second premolars are scored, however, but in this case, I don't know whether you can see this on the video or not. In my opinion, these lingual cusp tips are small, and therefore I will use my judgment not to score the second premolars. So this is my interpretation, not a part of the directions, other than the spirit of the measurements always requires good judgment of the examiner for the casts and for any morphological exigencies that may exist. So the total score for the mandibular cast is lower right first molar 1, the second is 2, 1 on both sides, and the lower left, and then the lower right's 1 on each side. So that's a total of 5 also. So both the maxillary and mandibular casts measure 5. That totals 10, which is a fairly high score for this particular case. So that's scoring of the buccal lingual inclination. The next parameter we'll move to will be the measurement of the overjet.